Dark Queens. On this bright day, I think spring is finally coming to this part of the world.
Yeah, it's not quite here yet, but there's, which is why I'm in layers of sweaters and y'all are not.
Well, I mean, I'm from a tropical country, so like any temperature, I'm just like, it's cold. But yeah, it is pretty warm inside the store though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
3:01, so I think that's as good a time to start as any. So, hey everyone, good afternoon. My name is Isa, and I am a bookseller at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I will be your host today. And I'd like to welcome everyone here to PNP Live. Thank you for joining us in this virtual format amid these unpredictable times, throughout all of which we strive to continue to bring you the authors that you love and their new books to our Politics and Prose community. At any point during the event, you can click the link in the chat to purchase Dark Queens by Shelley Puhak on the Politics and Prose website. It's got such a beautiful cover, and I'm just really excited for today. And additionally, you can ask the author a question by clicking on Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And while we will try to get to everyone's questions after this presentation, we apologize in advance if we do not have time to address yours. Finally, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We are so thankful to our community of friends and loyal customers for keeping our spirits afloat. So it is my honor to introduce today's guests. Shelley Puhak is a critically acclaimed poet and writer whose work has appeared in The Atlantic, Lapham's Quarterly, Teen Vogue, the Virginia Quarterly Review, and elsewhere. Her essays have been included in the Best American Travel Writing and selected as notables in 4 consecutive editions of the Best American Essays. She is the author of 2 books of poetry, and most recently, Guinevere in Baltimore, and she is also the winner of the Anthony Hecht Prize. In conversation with Shelley today is author, speaker, and historian Pamela D. Toler, who translates history for a popular audience. She goes beyond the familiar boundaries of American history to tell stories from other parts of the world, as well as history from other sides of the battlefield, the gender line or the color bar. Toler is the author of 9 books of popular history for children and adults, including Women Warriors, Unexpected History. Everyone, Please join me in welcoming Shelley and Pamela to PNP Live.
I'm delighted to have this chance to talk with Shelley about the Dark Queens because I loved this book. It's a great story with great characters. It's based on rock solid research. She's got a lovely, edgy bit of attitude when she's talking about the sources that she uses and their biases. And because Shelley is a poet as well as a storyteller, it's beautifully written. So I'm going to ask her to start us off by reading a short section. Before she does, I'll remind you again, questions need to go in the Q&A, and we will answer them at the end rather than trying to answer them as we go along. So take it away, Shelley.
Thank you so much. And Pamela, I am really excited to be in conversation with you. I think that the 2 protagonists of this book would be besties with a lot of the women in your Women Warriors. So yes. I them hanging out together. And a big thank you. I'm really thrilled to be doing this event for Politics and Prose. So I'm so happy that they're hosting us. And I am going to start with just a quick reading from the author's note at the very beginning. And it's called Shadow Queens. Weeks before Halloween of 2016, I found myself pacing the aisles of a costume store, frantic. My 9-year-old was determined to be a killer robot bunny, and we had spent evenings hot gluing wires and felt to a t-shirt, scouring Etsy for the correct demonic bunny ears. I had volunteered to help with the classroom party though, and I still needed something to wear, a quick and easy costume that wouldn't look too last minute next to those of the 2 moms in charge. I had a witch hat at home, but I was looking for something else, something a little less generic, a little more commanding. I scanned the displays of Cleopatra headdresses, pointed princess hats, and rainbow tinted wigs, until my gaze settled on the row of horned Viking helmets with long blonde braids glued on. I didn't know then that I had just started writing this book. No raider from the north ever wore one. The horned Viking helmet has its basis not in fact, but in the fantasies of a costume designer, Carl Emil Doppler, tasked with outfitting the cast of Richard Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen for the opera cycle's 1876 production, combined Greek myth and military sensibilities. Doppler's sketches featured flowing tunics and capes, long beards and armored bodices, and lots of helmets, winged ones for the female Valkyries and horned ones for the male warriors. It wasn't long before the opera's female lead, Brunhilde, regularly wore a helmet, winged or horned. Wagner's Ring is a 4-night epic, not a work for the casual fan, but even so, Brunhilde quickly became opera's most recognizable figure, a busty woman in braids and a horned helmet, hefting a shield and spear. And then, predictably, she became one of our culture's most lampooned figures. The opera cycle features a cursed ring, a power-hungry god, and incestuous siblings with giants, dwarves, and a dragon thrown in for good measure. But it also offers an all too realistic allegory for patriarchy, for the fate of females who wield political power. Brunhilde is a Valkyrie tasked with carrying dead warriors off to the hero's paradise of Valhalla. When she defies her father, Wotan, the king of the gods, she is punished. He strips her of her immortality and casts her in the role of a sleeping beauty, consigned to a rock surrounded by magic fire. She is able to be awakened only by a man's attentions. Brunhilde has a chance to be loved, but loses that too. With her lover dead, she mounts her horse and rides straight into his funeral pyre, burning the whole place down. The poignant aria that Brunhilde belts out just before immolating herself marks the end of the 15-hour opera cycle, giving rise to the expression, "It ain't over till the fat lady sings." This character has become yet another way to casually ridicule women's bodies and their stories. But while millions around the world are familiar with the image of operatic Brunhilde, few today recall that she shares a name with an actual Queen Brunhild, who ruled some 1400 years ago. The Valkyrie's fictional story is an amalgam of the real lives of Brunhild and her sister-in-law and rival, Queen Fredegonde, grafted onto Norse legends. I didn't know these queens' names when I stood in that costume store aisle, but at some level, I knew these queens. You know them too, even if your history books never got around to mentioning them. I've called them the Dark Queens, not only because the period of their rule falls neatly into the so-called Dark Ages, but also because they have survived in the shadows for more than a millennium. During their lifetimes, they grabbed power and hung on to it. They convinced warriors, landowners, and farmers to support them and enemies to back down. But like so many women before them, the inconvenient fact of their success was blotted out and their biographies right along with it.
Wow, I love that start. And I love the fact that you described them as shadow queens. And I've got a whole bunch of questions. We may not get through the end of them, so I'm going to jump right in with the one that I think comes to the heart of a lot of what you do. Because at first glance, it looks like you're writing about two obscure queens from an obscure medieval dynasty. And it turns out that isn't really true. So could you tell us a little bit about why both these two queens and then the dynasty they belong to are erased for us?
Sure. First, I think I'll start with maybe why we don't know more about the Merovingian dynasty, which was the dynasty they married into. And scholars basically estimate that less than 1% of the sources produced in that period have survived. And the answer, some of it's purposeful erasure, but a lot of it is just simple bad luck, because most of their documents were written on papyrus, which can last thousands of years in a dry, hot climate like Egypt. But once you bring it north into some, cold, damp climate like Northern Europe, it does not last nearly as long. And in the second half of the 7th century, there was a switch to parchment after papyrus became more difficult to import because of these various sort of trade issues. So the next dynasty writes entirely on parchment, which happens to survive, but the prior dynasty, wrote on papyrus, which did not. So that explains kind of the general lack of sources for the period. But the reason we don't know more about Fredegund and Brunhild in the sources that survive is because there was deliberate erasure. And it's a process that I detail pretty extensively in the epilogue of the book. But a quick overview would be the king that succeeded both queens happened to be the son of one and the nephew of the other, and he was named King Clothar II. And he set to work almost immediately erasing them from the public record. Any sort of bureaucratic mention of a tax or a toll or just the fact that they existed was completely wiped out. And then in other chronicles, while there were still some mentions of both queens, we can watch how the narratives were purposely shaped over time. So certain elements were added or removed to portray them as moral or as bad leaders. And collectively, all of these actions, I think, had the effect of saying they didn't have the right to be remembered.
So is there a clear reason why someone would try to erase his own mother from history?
Yes. So it seems as though his grasp on power was not as strong as he would have liked at the time. There were a lot of attempts to depose him. And in fact, one of these attempts was stopped by his own wife. And there's a record of a group of nobles coming to the king and criticizing him and saying, "We know that you take too much mention of the views of women, young and old." That's a rough paraphrase. And it was a reference to his mother and to even his queen. And so there was basically kind of a implicit threat to this king by a lot of the misogynistic forces that had taken over, that you need to sideline the women or we will sideline you.
Okay. So that not only do you not want women in power, but you don't want to see them as being the power behind the throne as well. The erasure works, obviously, because we don't know much. And then didn't the dynasty that followed the Merovingians also spend some time trying to make them less visible as well, in addition to time and fire?
Absolutely. And because they had a lot of women who were seeking to rule as regents. And in fact, Charlemagne's obviously grandfather was for a long time imprisoned by a woman who came pretty close to winning the throne. So they were not happy with that. And they kind of were doing their best as women popped up to push them off the scene. And they also wanted to make it clear that there wasn't sort of a history, a family tree of female power, so that any one woman was sort of striking out on her own rather than as part of this larger tradition.
It's interesting because we see that over and over again, this idea that whenever you get one or two of these really powerful women, they stand alone. And certainly in my work, and I know in yours as well, when you start looking more closely, you begin to find out that they're not alone. And you did some interesting writing about sort of the broader scape of powerful women in the 6th century. And what does that look like for us?
I think I had the same experience that you did, because I know, for example, with a lot of the, at least one of your warrior queens, right? Quite a few, you find out that it's actually their mother or their grandmother, or there's this long tradition of them being trained by another woman, right?
Right. Where there's a network of women that gets left out of the story in addition to the individual women getting left out. And
yeah, I think I initially went into this incorrectly, assuming they were, kind of these two exceptional women. And I was really surprised that there were so many women ruling at the same time in the 6th century. So just to give you a sense, there were some powerful queens before them, but at the exact same time that they were ruling, there were 6 female heads of state. So in addition to Brunhild and Fredegund, who are ruling over the Frankish Empire, which is most of Western Europe, there's a queen in Lombard Italy. There's an empress acting as regent in the Byzantine Empire. We have the first empress ruling on her own in Japan, and we have a queen ruling a Mayan state. And then on top of that, we have women who are abbesses or business owners and healers. And I think if we keep in mind that 1% figure, that less than 1% of the sources survive, that's just what we know about. So it's safe to say there probably are a few others that we don't know about. And I was really surprised not just how many female rulers there were, but then the support networks they were able to build among themselves.
Right. And were most of them that were actually rulers, did they get their authority from their relationship with a male ruler? I mean, at some level, Fredegund and Brunhild both do, but do all of them? I mean, that's one of the things I kept finding, but I don't know this period.
Oh, yeah. Oftentimes, at least initially, they would, I mean, there were cases where there were no male heirs in a particular family. So like prior to them, there was, a queen who was groomed to be her father's heir. And that was just assumed. And then whatever, and that was essentially the case too in Lombard Italy, where whomever she married would be her consort and would be able to rule as king, but only because she brought him into the marriage. But a lot of times, particularly with Brunhild and Fredegund, they married into this, and then, the men around them were assassinated and dropped dead at quite alarming rates. So there were a lot of opportunities for the women to be the more stable figure.
Right. And at some point, they start out ruling in the names of their sons as regents.
Yes. So that's, I think, an important point to make. They do rule as regents. What I think is really interesting is, particularly in the case of Brunhild, like even after her son comes of age, she's still ruling. Like she doesn't step aside, and she's listed first and alongside of him in the treaties. And he has a wife and a kid, and they refer to the royal pair, and it's her and her son. And then when he dies, she goes back to ruling again. But one interesting tidbit is that I think is really telling is that when people were arrested for forging in this time period, when she's ruling alongside her son, they're being arrested for learning to forge her signature, not his. So it tells you, and when he dies, it's interesting. There's not really a big hoopla in the sources, because essentially things continued on as they had. This queen had always ruled, her son ruled alongside her. Now he dropped dead and she continued ruling.
For her grandson now, right?
Yeah. When he was a baby. So there wasn't, so, and then she just kind of kept ruling for subsequent generations. So she was really the stable figure. And they refer to her as like the root of the family.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Now, and I may have this incorrect at this point. It's her grandson who ultimately has her killed, correct? Or is it nobles?
It's Fredegund's.
Okay.
Son, right. There's so many sons, and
I know.
and there's so much dysentery, and it's almost head spinning. I have to tell you, it was head spinning for me. So I hope it's not nearly as head spinning for readers, but to keep everyone straight. But it was her nephew who executes Brunhild.
Oh, that's right, because of course, Fredegund's son would be her nephew. So they rise to power, they subsequently get erased, but they still leave traces in our culture. I mean, you've mentioned the opera image, but it's not the only one. And in some ways, it's not the most interesting one, I think. Can you tell us a little bit about where they leave traces that we may not realize are theirs?
Sure. There are the Norse legends that inspire Wagner, and there are other aspects of their stories are incorporated into fairy tales and other legends. A lot of evil stepmother legends, for example, owe something to Queen Fredegund. There's a huge influence on Shakespeare. Fredegund was a very skilled warrior, and she rode into battle many times at the head of her troops. And one of her battle strategies was later adopted in Macbeth, where Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane. So she seems to have been the one to pioneer the walking forest strategy, where she disguised her troops. And she won the day, and she was known throughout, for a lot of these battle strategies that were then subsequently adopted by others. And I think we can also make a really convincing argument that there are really uncanny parallels between these two queens and Cersei from Game of Thrones. Because like both queens, while serving as a regent for underage boys, like Cersei assumes the throne herself. There are some other parallels in that, like Fredegund, Cersei's accused of infidelity, and when her adultery is discovered, she arranges for her king husband to have a convenient accident on a hunting trip, and Fredegund's enemies claim that she had her husband killed on a hunting trip. And Cersei was said to arrange the deaths of her stepchildren, as Fredegonde did. And we also see in Cersei's character a lot of paranoia about being replaced by a younger queen. And we definitely see that in Brunhild, where she would push aside a lot of the younger queens who came to marry her son and grandson.
Oh, interesting. So she's ruling as a regent, but she's really making sure she doesn't get a replacement with aspirations to become a powerful queen in her own right.
Yes, but I want to maybe qualify that, because one thing I thought was really interesting about Brunhild is we see that, but it might have also been more strategic because she was also really well known for her alliances with other women. And there's, for example, a treaty where she spends a third of it ensuring that other women in her family, a daughter-in-law, a daughter, a niece, have, and herself, that they all have protection, legal protection, so that they're able to own property. They're able to bequeath the property to anyone they want to. They can't be forced to marry, and they can't be forced into a convent. And she has that enshrined in law. So she definitely formed a lot of networks with some women, but there clearly were others that she did not care to form an alliance with for whatever reason.
Because the story often gets told in the places where it gets told in little snippets as this competition between these two queens, but it sounds like it's not as simple as that there's still, again, this idea of networks among women.
I was gonna say, there was, even strangely enough, even though these two queens battled one another for decades in a civil war, what I find really interesting is that there are actually moments of cooperation between the two of them that suggests that they were both really pragmatic at heart, and they didn't see this as anything personal. There was actually even a short-lived alliance between the two of them, where one symbolically adopted the other one's son as their heir. And we don't know how thrilled they were about this, but they were willing to work together for what they thought was the good of their individual kingdom.
Mm-hmm. And I think you argue that these two women actually shape the later medieval world in many ways, even though we tend to forget about them.
Absolutely. I think the way that they perhaps shape the medieval world the most is that the backlash against them is what really shapes Europe. So we could see that it leads to greater misogyny and a real fundamentalist streak in the church, which reverberates all the way through the Crusades, the wars of religion. There was, at one point, a real battle between like a more tolerant sort of worldview that was able to like live alongside other denominations and sects, and a much less tolerant one. And that one ended up winning out. It also, the defeat of both of them, it does away with the dream of a unified empire like Rome. So they're ruling in this transitional period. And there was the hope that a lot of rulers had that they could kind of reconstitute the Roman Empire, that there could be a centralized power. And after their demise, it really leads to these fragmented nation states that, we see throughout the rest of the medieval period.
And did the laws that Brunhild managed to get in place to protect at least some women, did those continue, or did those vanish?
Those essentially vanished. So a lot of those were kind of overwritten, and then because she didn't exist, so after her death, she was wiped out. They didn't. So we only know of them because they were written down in the accounts of her contemporaries, like as they were happening, but they were not then enshrined in later law.
Okay. Yeah, because my understanding was that, for instance, a lot of you no longer had an ability for a woman to inherit the throne, for instance, in that part of the world, because we don't want to repeat that. It's interesting because you really have centuries before you start having powerful female rulers again in Europe. It takes a long time to work through all that. We don't have these stories. You've got to be a history nerd to have those stories, but it seems like there's a real loss. And you suggest that by not having these foundational stories of women's power, that raises problems for, well, maybe raises problems isn't the right word, but there are consequences. for not having those stories. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that the stories we are told ourselves as kids and the stories we tell, our own kids really expand their sense of what is possible. And when these sort of figures are left out of history books, it really constricts the imagination of all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it reinforces the message that women don't deserve to be seen or heard or remembered. And, that is often internalized.
Right. Or if they are seen and heard and remembered, it's the wicked stepmother, the fat lady who sings,
Opera. Yeah.
That's right. Or the woman who only has power as an extension of a male figure. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say, did you find that for all of the women wars that you dealt with, that there were particular ways that they were like misremembered, as far as like, was one more prominent, like a wicked stepmother or the sort of conniving mother-in-law figure?
So many ways. Women warriors even in the more modern world were subject to an enormous amount of trash talking or being misremembered. One of my favorites, a woman named Moiya, who's 4th century CE in the Middle East, who fights against Rome. And in one of the later stories, this woman who clearly was a solid leader, a fine warrior, her story gets told as if she is a seductress who falls in love with an Arab sheikh and goes to war. I mean, it turns into this horrible movie version where it's all about sex and romance, forbidden romance, and that's the only reason she would have gone up against Rome. So yeah, I did see these over and over and over again, times where there's sort of the political erasure, but also times where there's just character assassination, plain and simple. It seems to be a basic.
And that love and romance trope is really interesting because Fredegonde and Brunhild have always been sort of cast in this cat fight, that one had a hand in the death of the other one's sister, and so the two of them were always kind of trapped in this love triangle, and that's the only reason women would fight against each other for like 40 years is
right
for a love triangle. They had no other ambitions, clearly. Yeah.
Precisely. So yeah, that comes out over and over and over, and when it isn't that, then it's you're fighting as the widow, you're fighting as for an absent husband, you're fighting in your father's shoes. So yeah, there were a lot of themes that felt very familiar when I read Dark Queens. There is so much wonderful story in your book, and you deal with big themes as well as the direct story. But is there just one idea that you want to be sure people walk away with?
Yes, I think I'd like readers to really think about our current political situation and the fact that we have yet to have a female head of state in the US. And yet in the so-called Dark Ages, we had so many women ruling. And we've certainly had female rulers since then, but oftentimes they're complimented for ruling like a man. If we think of like Elizabeth I or Margaret Thatcher, or they're outliers. For example, Vice President Harris definitely represents progress, but she's still the lone woman on the major party tickets. We've never had, an all-female ticket, for example. That would, is almost unheard of. And yet in, this early medieval period, we have women who are leading armies, and they are revamping tax policy, and they are serving as judges and undertaking these great public works projects, and they are negotiating with kings and popes and emperors as equals. And so I really would like the Dark Queens to serve as a challenge of sorts, that we ask ourselves, how far have we really come in 1400 years? And I was hoping that the act of writing Fredegonde and Brunhild back into history would be one small way to kind of push us to do better, to be better, to demand more.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things I kept coming against was this word exception, and the idea that the only way you get a woman ruler is as an exception, that that it stands outside history as a whole is a horrifying one, and yet it's still clearly where we are in some ways. Before I open up questions, anything else I ought to have asked you, but I didn't?
No, I mean, there are so many, I guess, great stories in here that I can really nerd out about, just, the various assassinations and battle ploys. But, just want to kind of give a shout out to both queens, because I want to say this story, I can't take credit for it, because if you wrote this as fiction, it would be edited out. Like, I'm certain of it, because it's just impossible. So I was doing the research. We're like, this many people can't be assassinated, and she can't certainly do this and this and that. And we have these like kind of daring midnight escapes and substitute babies and heirs coming back, to claim thrones. And so the story just itself, I think, is really dramatic and really juicy. And I love, Fredegonde and Brunhild, but I think the whole cast, there are just some really crazy, memorable characters in there as well.
It's a page turner. That's all I can say is it's a page turner. So we've got some questions. We'll start with, how did the two queens become rivals?
Well, they became sisters-in-law, and the short answer is that one of them, Brunhild, had married a king, and his brothers ruled the neighboring kingdoms. And so his brother, one of these other brothers, was quite jealous. She was widely acclaimed. She was a Visigoth Spanish princess. And the other king his brother decided, I am going to cast about for, a queen that's just as prestigious. So he married Brunhild's sister. But he soon got tired of her, and he was in love, or had been in love, with his palace slave Fredegonde this whole time. And when Galswintha decided that she was going to leave the king, he had her murdered, and Fredegonde became the new queen. So Brunhild and Fredegonde become sisters-in-law under the circumstance of one having potentially had a hand in the murder of the other's sister. But then after that, they're the queens of two rival kingdoms. So that gives them additional reason to scrap.
Mm-hmm. You've at least started the answer to this next question, which is, can you tell us the story of how you came to start researching and writing this book? And you've told us what led you to start thinking about it, but how did you find these two characters, this particular story?
So I have to tell you, I did not start out planning to write this book at all. And my background is as a poet. And I was working on a completely separate project, where, as part of a genographic project, which traces back your earliest maternal ancestors, I had a link to this earlier Viking queen who is quite fierce on her own. But as I'm reading about this queen who had this rivalry with the King of Norway, these two were in just this huge grudge match. And essentially, I come across a mention in the sources that says, if you think this grudge match is bad, you should see the grudge match between Fredegonde and Brunhild. And I had never heard of them. And around the same time, I also purchased that Viking helmet that I speak of. And I was like, that was the second time I'd heard the Brunhild mentioned. And I essentially kind of fell into this research rabbit hole and didn't come up for air for a couple of years.
Great. Yeah, and that's really the best way, is when the story finds you, instead of going out and cold-bloodedly looking for one. Ooh, this is a good one. And do you know of any plans to turn their story into a film or mini series?
I do not, but if you do, please, I would love to.
Well, with any luck, it will be with connection to your book. What was the most surprising thing you found in writing this book?
That's a tough question, because I have to say, I think on the regular, I was like, I can't believe this. I can't believe this. My family would get sick of me sitting at dinner and be like, you're not going to believe what happened. So I'm going to maybe just try to narrow it down. But I can say one thing that really surprised me was I assumed that these women would be doing this, and the men around them would be saying things like, this is crazy, or they'd be grumbling about it. And what I found really interesting is there's, for example, a poem that was written about Fredegonde, Queen Fredegonde. And this was well before she was regent. So this is when she's just the king's wife. And typically poems of the era would like praise a woman's, beauty, and you're great at managing a household, and, you're super fertile. Those were the typical compliments. And this poem goes on and on about how smart she is. And it actually says, you rule with the king. He can't make decisions without you. And I was really stunned that this was being said in public. I mean, this was a public praise poem that was being read out, that the king would be okay with it being widely acclaimed, that he had to rely on his wife so thoroughly. That, my understanding was a lot of times that this was someone who was advising behind the scenes. So I was kind of surprised that this was being done so openly. And a lot of other, comments that are made in the contemporary accounts where it's essentially like, don't make the queen mad. And again, this is before either of them are regents. So it's pretty clear that these women were wielding an enormous amount of power well before they were sitting on the throne themselves.
And just as a follow-up on that, do we know who commissioned that praise poem?
Yeah, no, it was, essentially her husband did. So,
okay.
Yeah. So, but he was clearly okay with it.
Okay. As opposed to it being hers and he's going, oh, I can't believe she did. Okay. What's your favorite juicy story?
I don't know. Do we want
sex, drugs?
That's what I was just say. Do we want adultery, assassinations? Pick one, mysterious, babies,
how about one of the secret baby stories?
It's fascinating that, well, there's a lot of secret babies, I have to say. And in fact, there was a child that, that maybe that's too many secret babies, but let's just say Fredegonde had a secret baby, and she kept him hidden. And then when, she was like, surprise baby, you can't get rid of me because I have this baby, so I'm going to be regent for this baby. But no one had seen the baby since its birth. It had been hidden away in a country villa. So likely it was her baby, but there were always questions like, if the baby had died, Fredegonde was smart enough to get a replacement. So there have always been these questions that the king, through which so many European monarchs claim their heritage, likely was Fredegonde's son, but we don't know for sure. We don't know. Could have been a substitute baby. Yeah.
And that's only one of many secret babies.
Many secret babies.
We've got someone who says it's so frustrating in the research process that so many sources in the past are simply gone. What historical item or source do you wish had survived, and what insight might it have provided?
Wow, that's a great question. And I can say that what's frustrating is there are mentions in sources to other sources, and those sources have disappeared. So that they existed at one point in time, and there were so many of them, but particularly there were more during the Queen's lifetime. So there are 2 contemporary events by men who are, actual eyewitnesses and sitting down and recording dialogue, but there were a lot more. And there's even one, for example, that references, I know this assassin's name because, and you're going, what's that source where you got the assassin's name from, and what else, how many other assassins' names that the Queen's hired is also in that source. So I really would have liked to get my hands on that source or any similar ones.
Cool. Can you talk about any travels you took to research the book, and if they informed your research in any way, or the inability to travel may have informed your research?
I was extraordinarily fortunate in that I was able to get in a research trip essentially right before the pandemic hit. I had a second one planned that was, canceled, but the summer of 2019, I was able to go to France and Germany and Switzerland, to a lot of the sites that are associated with the Queens, and to both of their final resting places. And I found that just hugely useful and illuminating. And even in, seeing, for example, the site where Brunhild was executed or where Fredegonde led her troops into battle. There's some things you can just learn from the landscape. You can't learn any other way. It's like seeing, oh, we're on this limestone ridge and there are these caves, and that's how the spies, there's mention of the spies hiding, but you go, well, of course the spies were able to hide because you are able to sort of see it and see what a vantage point she would have had being able to see the approaching army, or to see essentially where the river is that, you know, Brunhild had to cross kind of on her final days. Those things all really helped inform the narrative. And there were also a lot of these archaeological digs that I was really fortunate enough to be able to go on. So where you could actually see part of like the palace, you know, that Brunhild had resided in, and even part of the crypt where her husband was buried. And one thing I just want to share, this little like archaeological tidbit, is the Merovingians had these like fabulous teeth. So all of the skeletons have these like perfect Hollywood, like Crest White Strips teeth. And I found it absolutely astonishing. And you'd see one after the other that had been preserved this way. And apparently they had, you know, they had honey. So they were eating cakes, and it wasn't that they weren't eating sweets, but there was some sort of recipe for toothpaste that they were using. And I don't know that anybody's ever been able to duplicate it, but I really want the Merovingian toothpaste because I was envious of their beautiful teeth.
Wow.
Yeah.
That could count as the most surprising thing you discovered, actually.
Teeth. Yeah.
Great teeth. Who would have thought? Do we know how Fredegonde learned her military skills? And did she have a mentor for that? And following up on that, how did she end up being enslaved?
Those are both very good questions. And maybe I'll start with like her background and then move forward. That we don't know how she became enslaved, but we can take some guesses based on, I guess, reasonable inferences based on what she does and doesn't do. So it seems that she would have been taken captive as a child. The first mention of her is she's a child working as a slave in the royal household, and then she's promoted by a queen, sees her and thinks she's clever and promotes her, and she becomes a servant to a queen. And then she, of course, has her eye on the king and works her way up. But what we do know is that enslavement was much more temporary in this time period. So it wasn't necessarily hereditary, and people could be enslaved and then you could buy your way out. You could marry your way out. It was certainly not an enviable state of affairs, but it wasn't necessarily lifelong. But there were a lot of cases of former slaves who then become counts, or, you know, sort of prominent business people. But in those cases, they usually elevate a former family member. And Fredegonde never does that. And so there's like a lot of circumstantial evidence that suggests she was most likely orphaned and that she came from a very poor family, because she never makes a reference. She suppresses any mention throughout her lifetime of where she comes from, of any sort of like larger family history. So she either didn't want people to know about it, or she wasn't particularly, more likely, proud of it, that they were just sort of ordinary people. Mm-hmm. And the astounding thing, though, is she did know how to read. We don't know how she picked that up. She knew how to read Latin. There's plenty of evidence of that. And we know at the time that there were these battle handbooks that were written by former like Roman commanders. And a lot of the strategies that she uses, we can't say for sure that she read them, but are very close to what are in these handbooks, that it seems likely that she might have. We also know that she was quite friendly, or had at least good working relationships with a lot of her husband's generals, and then they worked underneath her. So it's also likely that she was getting advice in real time from a lot of the royal advisors.
Interesting. I hadn't realized there were Roman military guides still extant.
What she still liked was, I think, should be noted that people were surprised at her ingenuity. So while she used a lot of the tactics that were already established, what she was best known for was, you know, making the best use of the element of surprise and pulling off things that people hadn't done before. And that's why she was able to gain the upper hand, because she frequently went into battle with a much smaller force, but was able to dominate. So that's what's really interesting.
Cool. Can you tell us a little bit about the sources and how you accessed them?
Painfully. Honestly, now I need reading glasses and I didn't when I started, and that might be age, but some of it was like the really minuscule Latin script. So no, I shouldn't say that. A lot of these manuscripts have been scanned in and digitized. So in that sense, I am extraordinarily fortunate, because even 20 years ago, you would probably have to travel the world going to various different archives. And I also have to say, I had to do a lot of this research in the middle of the pandemic. So a big shout out to like interlibrary loan and a lot of librarians who just went above and beyond, because I would call them and I would be begging for this really obscure translation of a very obscure like saint's life from the 10th century. And they would say, I don't think I can get this for you. And I would, plead, and somehow they came through. So I have to say, the public library system in the middle of a pandemic really, really was my salvation.
Yeah. Librarians and archivists rock. Okay, this is one that I'm just going to read the question as it stands, because you may or may not be able to deal with it. She was intrigued by Stacy Schiff's biography of Cleopatra, and specifically about her research. So if you've read it, can you comment on whether you faced the kind of issues she did? And to what extent did you have to sort out the goals of earlier historians or of early historians?
I would say, yes, I faced many of those same challenges. I was more fortunate in that for Cleopatra, there is no one who sat down with her, for example, and said, I was dining with Cleopatra tonight and she said X, Y, and Z. So there are more sources, and we're very fortunate. But even with the sources that survive, you have to look really critically at the men who are reporting these things and say, well, will they lose their job if they say this? What will happen if they say that? For example, one of the sources that has survived, he hides any mention of this, but Brunhild's the one who got him his job. And he frequently, it's quite even keel about Brunhild, but he really goes after Fredegund. And you have to say, I wonder if that's because he can't insult his own, he really doesn't like women in power, and he can't insult his own patron. But he can insult, the queen of the neighboring kingdom. But in those sort of situations, you'd have to sort of sift through. Like there were cases when men would claim that they knew what was happening in a foreign kingdom, and you had to really go through and say, did they really have those connections, or were they just sort of repeating gossip or making things up? Or in the case of where you have a lot of these guys would say, I had dysentery, so I went to a saint's tomb and I got some dirt off the floor and I mixed it with water and I drank it and I'm cured. And, I'm a great medical mind. And in that case, like, do you believe what this person has to say about other epidemics? Or, you had to kind of look at the limits of who was speaking and what their agenda was.
And that's presumably true on people who are writing sometime after the fact as well.
Yes.
They all make it worse.
Their own axe to grind.
Yeah. And do you have sources from 50, 100 years after that are useful?
Yes. So there were contemporary sources. Then there were sources that are written about the time of both queens' death. And there are some that are about 50 years after their death. And then the next big one's about like 120 years. So you can see, even for some of the earlier sources, like the versions of them. So you can see how the original is transformed throughout like subsequent decades. So there might be something, for example, from 580 that says one thing, but by the time we get to like the 660s, you hold them up side by side and you're like, wow, that's really interesting that this has been added. And now there's a prophecy and a snake and women are really bad. And this also happened. And, they killed some babies. And so, it was interesting how things would be added to the original sources as well.
Well, because that means you get an idea of how attitudes are changing as well, not just the facts, which probably are, the additions may in fact be totally extraneous, but it's telling you why their role in history is changing in consequence. Would they have, and this, I'm sorry, this is a question that is totally unfair to ask, but it just occurred to me. Did they have any awareness of earlier queens?
Oh, yes. So both of them, what I think is really interesting about both of them is they grow up as little girls. Both would have been aware, for example, there was a queen, Amalasuntha, who had ruled Ostrogothic Italy, and she was murdered in her bath. But she was a queen who her father designated her heir, and she was like, there were so many stories about her. She was, pretty widely known throughout throughout Western Europe. And so they would have both been aware of her and a few others, just because of this would have been, those tales were in circulation at the time. So they certainly were aware of other female rulers, whether semi-legendary or actual, that had ruled within their lifetime or a few years prior to their birth. And I also wanted to mention that they're both born during this era of this really unprecedented climate change and in the middle of a pandemic. And both of those things lead to a lot of social mobility. So as they're growing up, they are seeing a lot of women who are taking leadership roles that maybe would not have been heard of a generation before, and maybe even a generation later weren't. But there was this entire generation of women who essentially grew up with this different idea of what it meant to be female and what was possible.
And that's one of the things you see over and over again, is it's in times of crisis, doors open up for women that weren't open before. And the only question is, how fast can they slam back closed, or whether they're able to keep a little piece open. And it sounds like they would have been, or at least Fredegonde would have been, aware of Roman writings to some extent. So, and one of the people that makes a comment in the questions, without it being really a question, about Boudica in Britain, which she knew from a child's book called The Dark Queens, which is a Dark Queen, which is why it came up. But would they have known about someone like Boudica? Or
It's hard to say, but certainly, because they're getting, Brunhild, for example, is getting a top-notch classical education. So she's being educated. A lot of these people, we can see Rome fell, in the West at this certain time, but they didn't know. They thought maybe that it was just changing hands. It was going to be essentially reconstituted. So they're being educated in the same way as, upper-class Romans were 50 years, 100 years ago. So I would just say that, for example, Brunhild would have known and knew Greek and Latin and had just a top-notch education, but I don't know if Romans would be learning about her, about any sort of rebel queens, or if that was stricken from the curriculum, so as not to encourage other women. It's possible. It's certainly possible.
Okay, interesting. And what were the language challenges you faced in accessing sources? In other words, what languages do you read that you were able to deal with these sources, and what did you have to deal with in translation?
My French, I can read in French passably well, but I still would oftentimes defer to, have to have people double check that for me. And my Latin is not great. So I often looked at works in translation, but I wanted to look at the originals as well. And for that, I was really lucky to be able to work with a Latin translator who I could say, I'm thinking that this is what this says when I go back to it. Am I right? And there was also a scholar I worked really closely with to sort of fact check the manuscript and to go through, and his Latin is impeccable. So that was really great too. There were often times where you could get the literal meaning of something, but there were shades of meaning that I might have missed. So I was really fortunate to have those other folks helping me out.
Yeah, because that is a constraining issue always. And I'm moving off of questions that are in the chat now, because how are they treated in secondary literature? Have historians of the time known what to deal with them, or do they kind of squash them off?
I'm gonna plug this little these great images inside the book, for example, which kind of tracks through the different centuries, how they're pictured. But I found it really fascinating that depending on the time period, sometimes they were there's these great, I don't know if you can see, but they were on playing cards that Louis XIV had, and they were examples of women he was not supposed to marry, for when he was young. So they certainly pop up, but there were times when they were portrayed as these throwbacks to these great, even though they weren't pagan, but these sort of pagan barbarian women when that was, really a big thing in the Romantic period. And there were other times when they were portrayed as, well, I guess, portrayed as like really awful. But then we have, some great times, like, I don't know if you guys can see this, maybe, but that's Brunhild being carried on a shield by her warriors. So it really depends in, as sort of time goes on, what use people could make of her. But when people, for example, were trying to, certain nation states and nationalism was a big thing, they would go back to one of these queens and go, oh, well, we've always been this great nation, and we can track it all the way back to the 6th century. So I guess people made, they were made what use of them they could to suit their own agendas.
Mm-hmm. Either so sometimes they are a foundation story, if not as one female power, but for a state, and they're more often, it sounds like, horrible examples
of what not to do,
of what not to do, or who not to be, or who not to marry, or the Q&As, we seem to have answered them all, or answered them, and it looks like we're coming to an end anyway.
Goodness, that was such an amazing talk, and oh my God, the girl power throughout the years. Amazing. But yeah, so I get to actually ask the last question for today. What are you both currently reading, or what would you like to suggest to our readers? Either one of you can start.
Well, I actually do have one that I've been plugging for several months now, so I'll give you a little time to talk. Nancy Marie Brown, The Real Valkyrie, is one of the most amazing books I've read in the last year. Looking at the Burka woman in Sweden, the warrior who turned out to be a woman rather than a man, and then looking at a bunch of sources, archaeological and written, and creating what her life might have been like. So she's alternating between almost fiction, historical fiction, and this really careful analysis of a wide range of sources. And it just blew me away. If you're interested in women's history, particularly medieval women's history, you need to read that and The Dark Queens.
I absolutely, have to second that. It's an amazing book, Pamela.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And I'm thinking I will plug one fiction and one biography. So I am a little late to the game, but Sarah Moss's 2019 Ghost Wall, for people who, are interested in that. If you want to think of an Iron Age historical reenactment that goes terribly wrong, that's a little snippet I'll give you. And I also just finished the biography. I'm going to probably murder the title, but it's Edith the Rogue Rockefeller, by Andrea Ross. And that is just great. And she is, as you know, like Chicago, kind of just incredibly influential in the history of Chicago, has been given the short shrift throughout time. And I think this biography was it was amazing how many people that Edith, careers that she launched, and the impact that she had on the city. So I definitely recommend that as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for those recommendations. It is actually going to be March soon, I believe that's Women's Month. But yeah, so thank you so much to both of you for sharing your time and your stories with us today. And to everyone who came by, we definitely appreciate you here. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you amazing programming and amazing conversations like this. And we cannot continue to host these types of events without your support. So once again, there is a link in the chat to purchase Dark Queens. It is on display on our store, in our stores right now. And don't forget to check their website for the most up-to-date event listings, as we have an amazing list to choose from. So we hope to see everyone soon under much safer circumstances. And thank you again, Shelley and Pamela, for spending your afternoon with us. And to everyone else, stay safe, stay warm, and stay well read.